This time I want to talk about one of the most badass individuals ever. In terms of death count, Stalin's up there with Mao for the most ever, tens of millions. Because I'm just going to talk about Stalin's early life. I want to really get into the mind of a monster, what creates a man like Stalin. But lots and lots and lots has been written and spoken about Stalin, the dictator. A lot of documentaries you watch about him pick up from 1917 or even after Lenin dies in 1924. But I'm interested in what makes a man like Stalin. What was his early life, his childhood like? There are a few documentaries on it, but none that are in great detail. Usually they just say stuff like, oh, he was a Georgian, he's from Georgia, and was a bank robber, and he went to prison, he was exiled in Siberia, and then that's about it, really. They don't go into great detail, but I really want to know, because he was such a monster, really. There were very few people paralleled in all history that was as sadistic, as mendacious as him, as really cruel and heartless. Just to give a little bit of a feel for how bad it was. I mean, every member of his family, barring literally one or two exceptions, ended up either in exile or dead. Literally every single member, every friend he ever had, one way or another, ended up dead or just exiled. If you ever got close to Stalin in any way, it was either a death sentence or something close to it. I mean, for example, he forced his second wife to kill herself, basically. This is later, this is after the period I'm going to talk about in detail, in the 30s, but she was really cut up about all the deaths that were going on in Russia at the time, and he just treated her really badly. He was like a man's man, a Georgian, like a late 19th century Georgian man. He dominated women in his life, and they did what he said. That was the way it went, And one evening he just berated her all night and was just rude to her, making jokes at her expense all night, even throwing little bits of bread at her across the table. This is in front of all party officials and high up Bolsheviks in the Russian government, just humiliating her, really. And the details of it exactly aren't clear, but she basically left the party and just shot herself. And that was his wife. And then he said that she left him, or she left as an enemy, and didn't really ever speak about her ever again. And he had a couple of kids with her and stuff. So anyway, that's just one example of personally what an a-hole he was. But on the political scale, it's way worse. So for example, historian Stephen Kotkin has described the crowning crime of the Soviets, of Stalin, was collectivization. So that what happened basically was in a nutshell, there's whole books about this, but in really briefly, Stalin in the late 20s decided that the way the peasants ran their farms and created wheat and food for the whole of Soviet Russia wasn't efficient enough, and the best way to deal with that was to collect them into bigger farms, bigger Soviet-run, state-run farms, but against their will. So, he'd send his men out to, Ukraine or modern-day Belarusia, and basically force the farmers, the peasants, into slavery, essentially. Any property they might have owned, any small holding, any, a tractor maybe, or a farmhouse, any property they owned that's just state property, that's the government's property. Your whole farm, any bit of land you might have owned, you don't own that anymore, and you're now forcibly moved to a collective farm, maybe a long way away, and forced to work there for the state. And the state, in return for that, the state gives you, in theory, everything. Shoes, food, agricultural equipment was all apparently held collectively. So that's collectivization. But the result of that was mass starvation, because it didn't work properly, and a lot of the peasants tried to fight back against it. And it's just a really, really brutal policy that didn't work properly. So it led to the mass starvation in all over, but mainly in sort of modern day Ukraine and Belarus, of 6 to 7 million people, they think. And that's obviously men, women and children. And, there's footage and pictures of, kids with distended bellies, famine, dying. Yeah, and actually Mao Chairman Mao did a similar thing happened in China on an even bigger scale. But and Stalin knew that this policy of collectivization, he knew what it was doing, and millions of people starved. And a lot of the people in the Politburo, or the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks, the high up, the very top people in the Soviet government, most of them were against the idea of collectivization when they were deciding it. But Stalin was like, no, he personally was like, no, this is what we're doing, this is the direction we're going. And when it became clear that it was causing a catastrophe, a human catastrophe, he didn't stop. He didn't say, okay, we've got to rethink this or tweak this or that. No, it has to be forced through. And that takes, I'm interested in what kind of a man, what kind of a mind, what creates a dude like that? What happened to him? What happened to be? Because 99.99% of every person I've ever met hasn't got that sort of character. I don't think, if it came to it, how could you be that unbending? But so there are just two examples, but there's loads and loads. I mean, he turned the whole of Soviet Russia into a police state. People were thrown into gulags. There's the seminal books are by a guy called Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago. And there's another woman, Anne Applebaum, who wrote about just a few million people died in gulags, which are just prison camps, really, out in Siberia. You were sent, hundreds of thousands, millions of people were sent there, and you were basically worked to death. Not exactly extermination camps like the Nazis had, like Treblinka or Sobibor. You weren't sent there and immediately exterminated and put in a mass pit. You were sent there and you were worked to death, however long that took. If you were strong, it might take a long time. Some people did survive gulags, but the worst ones, it's almost guaranteed a death sentence. There's one out in deepest Siberia where they think maybe 2 or 3 million people died in that one. There's a gold mine there, and they just send people down to just chip away at the gold mine. You have to bring up a certain number of carts, and if you fail... Anyway, it's just a hell. Stalin created a paranoid hell on Earth, and he personally was a real D-bag to pretty much everyone around him, to put it mildly. So anyway, I want to go back to his childhood and see... Because a lot of people, this is one thing that people say about Stalin and his childhood, is that one of the first things is that his dad beat him up. He had a nutter for a dad. And I've heard different historians say different things about it. The obvious thing is, he got beaten up by his dad loads when he was, from a young age. And that creates a nutter itself. That creates a psycho, someone who's just violent and holds life cheap, maybe. And I've seen other historians saying, no, that's not quite... There's lots of people that are beaten in their childhood and don't turn into that. I remember seeing one female historian, I can't remember her name, but she was saying that. She was saying, look, just because your dad hit you, it doesn't excuse a policy put in place that will cause millions of people to starve to death. But I think it's somewhere between the two, because he wasn't just beaten by his dad. It wasn't just like his dad hit him sometimes. I think his dad was a real psycho. So for example, there's one anecdote where Stalin's really young, like about 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and he goes round, one day he turns up on his neighbour's doorstep and his face is covered in blood. And he says to his neighbour, come quick, my dad's killing my mum. And they went there, and indeed his dad was strangling his mum in the process of maybe going to kill her. He didn't. But imagine that, you're like 8, 9 years old and your dad's beat you so bad that your face is covered in blood, and you see him pretty much about to beat your mum, strangle your mum to death at an age. I mean, I'm no psychologist, and real historians don't like to get into armchair psychology. They like to stay in their lane. And I understand that, but there's just no way that doesn't make a difference, right, to a little kid. So, talking about his mum and dad, his mum was a very religious person. Well, first of all, I'd say he grew up in a place called Gori, a little town called Gori, which is about an hour's drive from Tbilisi in modern-day Georgia. So I'm going to mention Georgia a fair bit, and every single time I mean the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia in America. I'm not going to talk about the state of Georgia once. But, Georgia... So, growing up in Gori, it's a backwater, really. it's not really close to anything. I mean, Tbilisi was the regional capital of Georgia, which was a part of the Russian Empire. So there was no Soviet Union at this point. He's born in like 1878 or 1879. It's not even 100% sure which year. But so Georgia was part of the Russian Empire. Russia ruled by the Tsars, the Romanov Tsars. And it had only been completely, fully part of the Russian Empire for not all that long, a generation or two. Before that, it had been like fairly fiercely independent for like 1,000 years. And it is today. I think even today, Georgians are like, really quite proud of their national identity and never really sat happily under the Tsars or under the Soviet system. So anyway, Stalin was born into a country where they were under the heel of the Russians, technically, but still had quite a strong sense of what it meant to be Georgian. And his mum was, I suppose, a fairly typical Georgian woman. There's pictures of her from the 30s, and she's quite a hard-faced sort of old lady, sort of bat-faced, sort of very serious, religious-looking lady. But apparently, in the 1870s, 1880s, she was hot. Apparently, she was a smoke show, and loads of different people. She was like the MILF around Gori. That loads of people, loads of different men coveted her or fancied her, or in fact probably slept with her, because there's all the biographies agree that there's the possibility that Stalin's dad might not have been his real dad. It might have been one of the other men that were like friends of the family, close to the family. Like he had a godfather, who a lot of people think maybe the godfather was actually his real dad. But anyway, technically his real dad was a guy called Beso, sometimes known as Crazy Beso, because it seems like he wasn't an actual nut. He was a drunk. He was a cobbler, so a peasant really. Didn't have a great deal of money, and became a drunk, a really bad drunk, a violent drunk, to the point where eventually he was just more or less a vagrant. And one time, more than once, he beat them pretty badly. And one key thing that happened in Stalin's childhood was that he got his arm really badly broken. It's really, really badly broken. Some people have said, I've read different accounts, but some say he got hit by a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage. But most say that his dad beat him really badly one time, within an inch of his life, sort of left for dead sort of a beating, not just... And that's, again, when you hear historians say, oh, just because daddy beat me, it doesn't necessarily... Well, there's a difference between daddy hitting you sometimes and being left for dead. That's... leaves real, I would imagine anyway, real psychological scars forever and ever, something you take with you, and I imagine. So before Stalin was even born, the couple, KK, his mum's name was KK, KK and Beso had two other boys that both died, that were born before Stalin, and both died in infancy soon after they were born. That happened loads in the age before penicillin. Infant mortality rate, especially in sort of rural areas, was astonishingly high. In the Victorian period in London, it was unbelievably high. And Stalin himself was a very weak baby and nearly died of just illnesses. And he was kind of physically weak his whole life. I mean, he lived into his 70s, but Stalin, even though he was a weak baby and a weak child, survived. But because of that, his mum was overprotective, massively overprotective. There's some striking similarities between Hitler's childhood and Stalin's childhood. They both had really protective mothers who had had babies before that had unfortunately died, and now this was like their one cherished boy that they would protect and wrap up in cotton wool. So the mum was like that, wouldn't let him out of her sight until he was 6, apparently, and was always just very, very, very protective and like overly loving, smothering even. That, as a mum, combined with a psycho dad that sometimes beat the shit out of you, that can create a particular type of person, like a really arrogant person who thinks they're the centre of the world, but also someone that's, can be really cold and heartless towards anyone, loads of other people at the same time, It can create a certain type of psychology. So when Stalin first went to school, apparently he was really clever, really bright for his age. I'm not sure how much of that is made up after the fact. I've heard one historian say that everyone that talks or writes about Stalin is lying one way or the other to an extent, in the sense that you are either writing because you love Stalin, or you were forced to write great things about him because he was still alive, and that you had to do that, or after he died and there was the de-Stalinization of Russia, there was obviously a backlash and people wanted to write histories about how all the earlier ones were made up. They were just, Soviet propaganda, and in fact he wasn't amazing. So it's sometimes hard to get to the real truth of things, especially, we're still talking about rural 19th century Georgia, so there's not fantastic amounts of rock hard solid proof. There's mainly just people's accounts that knew him and their memoirs, and their subject. They're not necessarily the best sources, but it does seem that Stalin was clever. That's one thing that's a bit annoying when you think of what a psycho arsehole he was at the end. You look at him, you see the pictures of the sort of fat, rotund Stalin from World War II era or after, and you think, there's the face of a butcher, horrible, backward guy. How could he possibly be really clever and really well read and into poetry and into singing? He was like a choir boy. Even his whole life he liked to sing. Even in his 70s he would sometimes break into song, and apparently had a really good voice. It's hard to reconcile these things sometimes. His first language wasn't Russian. He had to learn Russian. Even later in life, apparently he always kept the Georgian accent, which people would sometimes take the mickey out of him for, behind his back, of course. But it seems he was a rapacious reader, whatever he could get his hands on, any book he could get his hands on, he would read. But he was also the naughtiest boy, apparently. Would just, even when he was really quite young, be into gangs, like schoolboy gangs, like with like running street battles and being a bit more aggressive and violent than any of the other boys, and insisting on he was like the leader of any little gang and stuff. But all this is all a bit perfect, don't you think, for if you're going to rewrite Stalin's childhood to be cooler or better, which they did. Stalin commissioned his own history when he was an old man in the late 40s, 50s, and he would only want the stuff he wanted in it. But yeah, it does seem that from nearly all the accounts I've read, people said that even as a child he had, a je ne sais quoi, something about him, like a twinkle in his eye, or just there was something about him that he had charisma, basically, it seems. And there was another incident, actually, but while he was still what you'd probably call a child or an early adolescent, he did get hit by a carriage one time. Apparently he was coming out of his school, and a futon came by, which is like a horse-drawn carriage, and a bit of it hit him in the face, knocked him down, and then run over his legs. So he got both his legs run over by a horse-drawn carriage, and apparently it nearly killed him. He was in hospital for months. Missed school for months, and his mum thought he was going to die, but he managed to survive. And the rest of his life, he had a bit of a funny walk. In fact, one of the nicknames he got later in life was the Loper, because he had a bit of a funny walk. And like I said, his arm, where his dad had smashed his arm up terribly, was bad the rest of his life. At one point during World War I, I'll get to this later, but he couldn't join up for service because his arm was too buggered up. And you actually see, even in propaganda pictures from the 40s, he won't be waving that arm around or doing anything. It would just be in his pocket or just by his side. So, it didn't stop him from fighting. It wasn't like a real disability. He could still use his hand and everything, but he wasn't fighting fit. And another thing that happened to him when he was a kid, he got smallpox. And smallpox is a real killer. Again, he was lucky to survive it. And he apparently had pockmarks all over his hands and face afterwards. And most pictures you see of Stalin are black and white and not, certainly not HD, and you don't really see it. But there are a couple of pictures I've seen, a couple of bits of footage from like Potsdam or something at the end of World War II, where you do see just the right light and you see his face is really, really pockmarked. He must have had smallpox really quite bad. So anyway, there was quite a few times when he was a kid when he could have just died. It's one of those things like, if only he'd died, how different history might have been. If only he'd just succumbed at that point. But there's loads more examples of this throughout his life. One of the things I would say that's most remarkable about Stalin the dictator is that he ever got there. That there were so many times when he could have, should have by rights been killed or died and didn't. So as I mentioned, one of the things Stalin excelled in was singing. He was a choir boy. He was like the lead choir boy in the Gori school choir. And as I mentioned as well, his mum was really religious. Everyone there was Christian. Georgia, even to this day, is like a Christian bulwark against like Muslim Persia or the Ottomans or that whole part of the world. They consider themselves quite heavily Christian, and Stalin's mum particularly was very religious. And in those days, one of the highest things in their society, in their culture, that you could aspire to was to become a priest. That gave you just real authority and power, and that's what Stalin's mum wanted for Stalin. By the way, he wasn't called Stalin. That's not his actual. That's just like a nom de guerre. It's a name of war and nom de revolution. His real name was Yusef Yugashvili, or Joseph Yugashvili. That's his real name. His family were, and Yugashvili is a fairly typical Georgian name. They're all really long and fairly difficult to pronounce. So throughout this, I'm not going to say a lot of people's names. I'm just going to say, this was Stalin's girlfriend at the time, or this was Stalin's associate. I'm not going to say their actual name. Oh, so Stalin means man of steel, and he didn't start using that name until like 1915 or 1916. So that's quite a late thing, actually. And it's funny, actually, on Stalin's name, he was known as loads and loads of different things. Because in his adult life, he was a revolutionary, like a proper professional, full-time, hiding out from the cops and the secret police revolutionary. So he had loads of nicknames and aliases and all sorts of things. So the guy's real name was Yusef Yugashvili, but he as a kid, his parents and his friends called him So-So. And people that were the closest to him called him So-So, or Comrade So-So. But when he was a teenager, he read a book where the main character was someone called Korba, and the Korba character in Russian or Georgian folklore is like a Robin Hood type figure who robs from the rich to give to the poor. And that's like great if you're a Marxist, if you're a budding young Marxist. So, and he loved Korba so much that he started telling people, call me Korba. And people did, and apparently loved it whenever they did. And he started that when he was really quite young, like a teenager, and all through the most of his 20s and 30s, he was known as Korba, Comrade Korba. Like Lenin knew him as Korba, mainly. In fact, there's a funny, bit of an aside, but there's a funny letter that survives where Lenin sends a letter to somebody else, an Oviev or someone, really late, like in 1914 or 1915, saying, remind me what Comrade Korba's real name is. I remember it's like Yugashvili or something, but I can't quite remember. Can you remind me? And that's interesting because by that point, they've met each other many, many times, spent loads and loads of time in each other's company, loads of time, and, debated stuff over the years, corresponded with each other by letter, and he still mainly knew him as Korba. So anyway, but he had loads of other names. I mean, I'll talk about them when they come up, but he was known as by the Okhrana, which is the Tsarist secret police, his enemy. Yeah. They knew him as various different things. Kepura was one of them, the pockmarked one, because I say he had smallpox scars. Gezar, the loper. One time I was known as the priest, like jokingly, because he went to a seminary. So as I said, his mum wanted him to be a priest, but to become a priest, you have to go to a seminary, which is a priest school, a religious school. In Islam, I think they're madrasas, if you want to become an imam. Mm-hmm. So anyway, and the best seminary in the whole of Georgia was in Tbilisi. Actually, that city is now called Tbilisi, but back then it was called Tiflis. It's the same place. Tiflis is Tbilisi. I'm actually going to call it Tiflis, if it's okay, because that's what it was called then. So she wanted to send him there, but it cost money to get in for a start, and they had none. They were really quite poor. Dirt poor. Really dirt poor. I mean, the dad, Crazy Beso, wasn't really around anymore. He just disappeared, and he was just couldn't rely on him, and he wasn't there, and he didn't have any money anyway. And if he did get any money, he'd spend it on booze for himself. So the mum struggled to, make ends meet, but she, like I said, she was meant to be a dime piece. So loads of different guys would just sort her out with money and stuff, and sort her out with connections. So she wanted her darling So-So to go to the seminary, and they sort of made it happen. She got some connections which you had to either have a bit of money or be the son of a priest, and Stalin was neither. So yeah, he was lucky to get in. But anyway, he did. He eventually got in, and apparently he was really good. He was like 5th in his year, so he was really good at it. And somewhere I've seen him described as, because that's a contradiction. That's the thing about Stalin. All throughout his life, he's like such a contradiction. In one way, he was a coddled mummy's boy. She like overdressed him. Like she made him wear over the top formal stuff. So he was like half sort of a street urchin that would get in fights all the time and be the naughtiest kid and be like the leader of a street gang and be just a good mummy's boy. So it was a funny sort of contradiction of things. So Stalin was sent to the Christian seminary in Tbilisi. I should know his exact age at that point, but I can't quite remember. It's going to be about 14, I think, 14 or 15, something like that. But when he goes there, it's pretty hellish. Even though it's a school to make priests, it's been described as every vice that's unchristian that could go on, did go on. They called it the Stone Sack. That's what this seminary is called. It's famous, or sort of famous. And I've heard it described as like the worst of like a British public school. In other words, beatings and buggery, not to put too fine a point on it. Or like a prison, like a ball stool. If you're sort of weak and you end up being someone's bitch, it's bad news. I mean, Stalin didn't have to worry about that sort of thing because he was a thug even then. Maybe I haven't stressed it enough, but apparently on the streets of Gori, fighting was just the absolute norm. There's certain places like Boston has got a reputation for just being rough, that people just fight all the time over nothing. I don't even know if that's true about Boston, but that's the jokey, stereotypical thing, isn't it? Well, apparently Gori really was like that. Like, all Georgian men fought all the time. And just like priests would be like ad hoc referees in the streets for street fights, and like dudes that were like the hardest bar brawlers were just known as like local celebrities almost, and it went all the way down through the school kids and stuff. And Stalin was the leader of a little gang even when he was a kid, even before he went to the seminary. So he was tough. There's one story where he was on a school trip and they're crossing a river or fording some sort of bit of water, and one of the teachers picks up one of the kids and puts him on his back like a piggyback to carry him across. And Stalin even then says, like, I wouldn't let anyone ride on my back. I think he said, I wouldn't let God himself ride on my back. And that, that speaks of the psychology of someone with, I don't know, well, a bit of a chip on their shoulder, I suppose, where they're thinking like that, even as a kid. But if you can imagine, like I say, if you've been beaten by everyone around you, and that's the other thing, his mum also beat him as well. Not badly, not like within an inch of his life or anything, but apparently she did hit him regularly, and he still loved her. So that's like a weird relationship where you're besotted by someone that's also physically abusive to you, even a little bit, is an odd sort of, not sadomasochistic, but it's not entirely healthy, is it? But anyway, so when Stalin goes to the seminary, he can hold his own, but it's still a really brutal place. And there he basically became a Marxist. It's there that he went from a choir boy, albeit, a street savvy, kind of brutal choir boy, believing in God, I suppose, to a Marxist. This seminary, the Stone Sack, turned out quite a lot of men that ended up being revolutionaries. I heard one historian say that no other seminary in history has ever turned out more atheists than this one. Because to be a real communist, a proper Marxist, you can't be a Christian.